This video documents Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey's trip to Pembina in 1851. In 1851, Minnesota was still a territory, encompassing portions of future North and South Dakota. Millard Fillmore was the President of the United States, and Alexander Ramsey was the territorial governor of Minnesota. Ramsey had recently helped negotiate treaties with the native Sioux tribes, who ceded large tracts of southern Minnesota land to the United States government. In late August, Ramsey planned a trip to Pembina to negotiate with the native Chippewa tribes for more land. Details of this trip were printed in a series of articles in the Minnesota Pioneer. The author was J.W. Bond, who accompanied Ramsey on the trip. Other than Ramsey and Bond, several other men, including Pierre Bottineau, accompanied the group. In addition, 25 soldiers from Fort Snelling and a group of Métis were along, making a total of about 50 men. Ramsey turned 36 years old during this trip and was the first territorial governor of Minnesota. Pierre Bottineau was a Métis, or a mixed-blood French-Canadian and Chippewa, about 35 years of age. He had spent his entire life in the territory. As for transportation, the soldiers brought 6 wagons for their supplies. The Métis had 8 ox carts to carry the Ramsey party's baggage, and an unknown number of horses were brought along for riding. Day 1 of the expedition was August 18, 1851. The various groups left St. Paul or Fort Snelling and traveled to the Thousand Isles, south of Sauk Rapids, Minnesota. Although these groups were all part of the same expedition, they rarely traveled within sight of each other. The soldiers came from Fort Snelling, at the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers. They likely crossed the Mississippi and traveled north along the east side of the river. Some members of the party took the steamboat Governor Ramsey from St. Anthony, east of modern-day Minneapolis. The wooden ox carts were made by the Métis and had very high wheels. Since the wheels were not greased, they constantly creaked and groaned. Finally, some members of the expedition traveled to the Thousand Isles on horseback. The Thousand Isles, or islands, were located south of modern-day St. Cloud and Sauk Rapids, where the Mississippi River widened and featured a number of islands. On day 2, or August 19th, the party proceeded to Jeremiah Russell's trading post. Russell's post was about 2 miles north of modern-day Sauk Rapids. On day 3, August 20th, the party crossed the Mississippi River and camped about 2 miles west, along the Sauk River. This well-known Métis route is shown by the red line, and the rough distance traveled that day is shown by the black circle. Crossing over the Mississippi likely involved a ferry, since the river was pretty wide and fast-flowing. The group traveled west over the Métis Trail. Day 4 was August 21st. The trail followed along the Sauk River Valley, which was bordered on either side with thick woods. Bond described it as the worst piece of road on the trip. Marshy areas and sloughs bogged down the wagons, carts, and horses. On day 5, August 22nd, the party continued westward. They crossed the Sauk River, which was about 4 feet deep, and passed into a rolling prairie, thickly interspersed with marshes and small streams. The drinking water was bad, and the mosquitoes worse. The party discovered a bear loping over the prairie, pursued and killed it. Day 6 would have been August 23rd. The expedition was constantly slowed down by the marshy areas, but made their night camp on the banks of a lake. Bond described the spot as the best one they had seen yet. Their diet so far consisted of a lot of tea and salted herring, which was not great. The party also came along a skunk and gave chase, staying upwind of it. After a slight battle, it was also killed. August 24th brought the end to the first week of travel. An early morning thunderstorm roused the group, but being a Sunday, it was a day of rest. Some people passed the day hunting pigeons and ducks. 4 of their horses were scared from the storm, broke their ropes, and ran homeward. Luckily, the soldiers who were trailing behind caught them. The Métis spent part of the day mending their carts. The party got moving again on August 25th. They continued through rolling prairie interspersed with small streams. Around the noon hour, they stopped north of White Bear Lake, now called Lake Minnewaska. Here they dined on roast skunk, which some of the party were quite fond of. They camped on the shore of Pike Lake, where they suffered through a cold night. They dined on roast goose, ham, and hard bread. On Tuesday morning, August 26th, they had to wear their coats to stay warm. The road winded over rough terrain full of lakes and ponds. They stopped for their noon meal on a high knoll above a lake, which Bond said was the prettiest spot he had seen yet. On the lake below, waves crashed against the shore. Day 10 was the 27th of August. They crossed the Potato River and camped on the open prairie, where there was no wood in sight. This camp was near the Continental Divide, which was where water either flowed northward into the Arctic Ocean or southward to the Gulf of Mexico. 2 members of the group went hunting and brought a large quantity of fowls back to the camp. Bond noted that they often killed more than they could use. August 28th was their last full day in Minnesota. The country was flat, dry, and uninteresting. Some portions of the grasslands had been burned. Bond's group crossed the Bois de Sioux River and camped on the western side. The burned grassland was the result of prairie fires, large uncontrolled burns started by lightning or people. Just north of their camp, the Red River of the North was formed by the joining of the Bois de Sioux and Ottertail rivers. They would be following the Red River northward to Pembina. That night they supped on a Métis soup made of geese, onions, and potatoes called bouillon. At 10 p.m., a strong thunderstorm struck their campsite, causing the tents to flap and blow. Day 12 would have been the 29th of August. In the morning, the soldiers crossed the Bois de Sioux River, which was about 50 yards wide and 4.5 feet deep. Later they crossed the Wild Rice River over a log bridge. Bond thought the Wild Rice looked like a deep ditch of dirty water. To cross the Bois de Sioux, the soldiers rafted over their goods, while the horses waded or swam across. On August 30th, the road veered more sharply away from the Red River. The road skirted west of the Red River, an average of 30 to 40 miles, to avoid swampy places. Bond wrote that the flies, gnats, and mosquitoes were terrible, and sandhills were becoming more prevalent. That morning, the entire camp was awakened by a false alarm. After having tea, they settled back into bed. Throughout the entire trip, they never encountered another human being. As they neared the Cheyenne River, timber grows became more abundant. Also, the mosquitoes began to swarm like bees, entering the mouth, nose, ears, and eyes. Tents were filled with smudges, which created smoke to fend off the ferocious swarms of bugs. August 31st marked the 2-week point of the trip and was another Sunday, or day of rest. The party crossed the Cheyenne River on a rough log bridge. Bond wrote that the Cheyenne had steep banks, was muddy, and heavily wooded. As they came up the other side, the first 2 buffalo of the trip were spotted. This caused a great deal of excitement as the men grabbed their weapons and horses and gave chase, even Governor Ramsey. The party managed to kill both animals. Once again, the hunt was mainly for sport, as they had no intention of keeping all the meat. They only kept the choice parts, and the liver and kidneys were fried for dinner. Bond noted that buffalo was not as good as beefsteak, being somewhat tough and dry. They camped that night near the kill spot. Day 15 was the first day of fall, September 1st. After traveling over a flat, marshy prairie, they crossed the Maple River on a rough log bridge. Much like the Cheyenne, the Maple had high banks and was ditch-like. The mosquitoes bothered the travelers all day. The horses started to look lean from the long trip, bugs, and lack of grain. After making their camp, hunters rode out and shot another buffalo. During the chase, Pierre Bottineau was thrown from his horse and knocked senseless. His comrades bled him, brought him to camp, and put him to bed. Once again, only the choice parts of the buffalo were kept, and the rest were left to the wolves. Day 16 was Tuesday, September 2nd. Bugs continued to bother the party, but they pressed on and crossed the Rush River. Bond wrote that the country was flat and uninteresting, with no wood in sight. However, buffalo started to become plentiful. Day 17 was midweek. Bugs continued to prey on the group, and the only wood was what was carried in their carts. In the afternoon, most of the party went buffalo hunting. Day 18 brought the expedition about halfway between the Bois de Sioux River crossing and Pembina. They had been sleep-deprived from the mosquitoes, so they headed out early. Their route today was along several branches of the Goose River. Some members of the party managed to take a bath in the river. Bond noted that wood remained scarce, so their meals today consisted of cold, boiled pork, and buffalo. That morning they discovered 6 buffalo near camp, but since their horses had run off, they could not get close enough for a shot. Since they had little wood, the Métis made a fire of dried buffalo chips. Although this got the job done, it did give off a strong smell. A band of wolves surrounded the camp and howled fearfully all night long. Day 19 was the 5th of September. The expedition traveled over nothing but level prairie with ridges or knolls, and a small pond or two. Bond wrote that the southwest breeze that day was fine and pleasant. On Saturday, the 6th of September, the group continued to push northward. After the warm day yesterday, today was windy, cloudy, and cold. Luckily, the group found their first wood in 4 days. Without firewood, the party requisitioned any empty barrels or boxes for small fires. That morning, their young Métis chef, Joseph, told stories around the breakfast fire. He spoke in Sioux and was known as the best shot in the party. That night, they witnessed a fine exhibition of the Northern Lights. Bond said that words could not do it justice. Sunday, the 7th of September, was also a day of rest. The party enjoyed a beautiful early fall day. Some read and some slept in. This was the 3rd week point of the trip. Some of the Métis spent the day hunting and brought back several ducks and geese. The group was back on the trail on day 22. The morning was chilly, being 36 degrees at sunrise. They passed the Big Salt River and the Little Salt River, which were heavily wooded with oak trees. They stopped for the night on the north side of the Cart River. In passing through the Big Salt River, Bond noticed that some of the boulders were painted. Some had red stripes, one had a blood-red hand, and another had 4 yellow horseshoes. Day 23 was Tuesday, the 9th of September. The country featured rolling prairie, dotted with belts of timber on all the numerous streams. The party was now descending back into the Red River Valley. They camped that night on the southern edge of the Poplar Isles. These were groves of poplar trees scattered for miles over the prairie. Day 24 was the midpoint of the week again. The expedition crossed through the Poplar Isles and reached the Tongue River. Here Bond said the mosquitoes were just as bad as at the Cheyenne River. Day 25 would be the last day on the trail. It was a cold and cloudy day, but they passed Bottineau Point and traveled into Pembina. They stopped for their noon meal near Bottineau Point, where they shot about 50 ducks. They feasted on roast duck, pork, boiled buffalo tongue, potatoes, and tea, then had wild plums for dessert. At 4 p.m. they came in sight of the first houses at Pembina. Some members of the group rode ahead and were treated to milk and potatoes. The Métis in the settlement saluted the group with gunfire. The Pembina Settlement was on the west side of the Red River and north of the Pembina River. The Red River was about 100 yards wide, muddy, heavily wooded, with willows along the edge of the water. The Pembina River was about 25 yards wide and also very muddy. All over, the ground was covered in a sticky mud from 3 years of persistent flooding. Norman W. Kitson's trading post was located in town, likely next to the fork in the rivers. His post was covered with large squares of bark. The town itself had a half-dozen log dwellings and some Métis lodges. The American flag flew from a tall staff. Several hundred people were present, along with dogs, horses, and cattle. The group camped on the south bank of the Pembina River, opposite of town, for the night. Kitson sent over some butter and eggs as a present. Bond noted that they slept well despite the sounds coming from all around. Day 26 was spent exploring the area. First the group crossed over the Pembina River and walked through town. Bond wrote that the town had a square, and the houses and lodges were built around it. The houses were more substantial, built of logs, while the lodges were constructed of bark and skins. Also around the square were warehouses, an ice house, blacksmith shop, and the trading house, which gave the appearance of a thrifty little town. Bond's group was treated to a grand dinner of hot corn, potatoes, and onions at Kitson's house. About a mile north of town, the group explored the Catholic church grounds, operated by the Reverend Belcourt. The Métis in the area were mainly Catholic. The party then traveled another mile north to the international boundary line, or the 49th parallel. A post had been planted there by soldiers from Fort Snelling 2 years before, and it bared the date they were there, August 14th, 1849. Another drawing about 20 years later still showed the boundary marker in place. On the Canadian side of the boundary was the trading post and buildings of the Hudson's Bay Company, a rival to Kitson. Bond noted that the buildings were constructed of wood and were built around an open square. Another drawing shows the fort from a different angle. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.